Bismillah.
Auzubillahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Assalamu alaikum Jamian. Alhamdulillah, today we are on the fourth majalis of the series of 6 majalises which are arranged by KSIJ Melbourne, which is up until Saturday, Shabi Ashur, and every day the program runs at 7 p.m. Today, inshallah, we're starting the program with the tilawat of Quran Pak, and I would call upon Brother Ali Lakhani for a recitation. Bismillah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إذا الشمس كورت وإذا النجوم انكدرت وإذا الجبال سيرت وإذا الإشار عطلت وإذا الوحوش حشرت وإذا الجبال سيرت وإذا النفوس زوجت وإذا الموءودة سئلت بأي ذنب قتلت وإذا الصحف نشرت وإذا السماء كشطت وإذا الجحيم سعرت وإذا الجنة أزلفت علمت نفس ما أحضرت فلا أقسم بالخنس الجوار الكنس والليل إذا عسعس والصبح إذا تنفس إنه لقول رسول كريم ذي قوة عند ذي العرش مكين مطاع ثم أمين وما صاحبكم بمجنون ولقد رآه بالأفق المبين وما هو على الغيب بضنين وما هو بقول شيطان رجيم فأين تذهبون إن هو إلا ذكر للعالمين لمن شاء منكم أن يستقيم وما تشاءون إلا أن يشاء الله رب العالمين صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Jazakallah, brother. Thank you very much. Now I would like to call upon Brother Zain Mudassir Bhai to recite Salam. Bismillah, Zain Bhai.
जी अस्सलाम वालेकुम। आप सबको मेरी आवाज सही आ रही है?
वालेकुम सलाम जी, बिल्कुल।
कासिम की लाश के टुकड़े बिखर गए, कासिम की लाश के ٹکڑے بکھر گئے، شبیر ڈھونڈتے ہیں، شبیر ڈھونڈتے ہیں، قاسم کدھر گئے،
ہائے
قاسم کی لاش کے ٹکڑے بکھر گئے، سینے لگا کے میت قاسم کی ماں پکاری، سینے لگا کے میت قاسم کی ماں پکاری، جینے کے دل جو آئے، جینے کے دل جو آئے، اعلان مر گئے، قاسم کی لاش کے ٹکڑے بکھر گئے، اور سرور کے پیچھے پیچھے آئی ہے سیدہ بھی، سرور کے پیچھے پیچھے آئی ہے سیدہ بھی، گٹھڑی اٹھائے مولا، گٹھڑی اٹھائے مولا، رن میں جدھر گئے، قاسم کی لاش کے ٹکڑے بکھر گئے، اور ٹکڑوں میں اس طرح سے لاشا بٹا ہوا تھا، ٹکڑوں میں اس طرح سے لاشا بٹا ہوا تھا، قرآن کے ہوں جیسے، قرآن کے ہوں جیسے پارے بکھر گئے، قاسم کی لاش کے ٹکڑے بکھر گئے، بر محمد و آل محمد صلوات،
اللہم صلی علی
محمد و آل
محمد عجل فرجہ.
جزاک اللہ زین بھائی. Thank you very much, and definitely you have touched the hearts of Mu'mineen with your beautiful voice. Now I would like to call upon respected scholar brother Sheikh Hasnain Gubani to deliver the lecture for today. Sallu ala Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين خالق السماوات والأرضين الحمد لله الذي بعث أنبياءه بالحق والهدى ثم ختمهم بحبيبه المصطفى الحمد لله الذي جعل إكمال ديننا وإتمام نعمته بولاية المرتضى الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله ثم الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيب إله العالمين بالقاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين لا سيما بقية الله في الأرضين أما بعد فقد قال الله في كتابه وقوله الحق بعد نقول أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم من المؤمنين رجال صدقوا ما عاهدوا الله عليه فمنهم من قضى نحبه ومنهم من ينتظر وما بدلوا تبديلا صدق الله العلي العظيم صلاة على محمد وآل محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. My elders, brothers and sisters of Melbourne community and other people watching, other mu'mineen around the world watching, I greet you with Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We have now reached the fourth lecture in our series in which we have been talking about the importance of integrity when it comes to the values of Ashura, the lessons of Ashura, how important it is that we have integrity in our actions, which means that those values that we claim that we have, those principles that we claim that we have, that they should also be reflected in the actions that we do, in the stands that we take in this life, so that it should not end up in a situation where we claim to be following certain things, that we claim to have certain values, that we claim to keep certain things as important in our life, but when we are tested, when we have to show our true colors, so to say, then those values are no longer upheld. We don't want to be like the people of Kufa who call upon their imam, who ask the imam to come, and then when the imam comes, they abandon him. We pray for the hastened reappearance of Imam al-Hujjah ajalallahu ta'ala farajahu sharif. But as much as we pray for the hastened reappearance, we also have to pray for our actions to be aligned with our values and with the purpose of the reappearance of Al-Hujjah ajalallahu ta'ala farajahu sharif. Now, yesterday we started to speak about dunya, how the dunya tries to lure us, what is to be taken away from dunya, what is to be appreciated in dunya, and what is to be left of dunya. And we mentioned that there is something called the motivational triad, those things that motivates our action in dunya, right? So we said the motivational triad, that those things that motivates our behavior is pleasure, that we look for pleasure, that we want to avoid pain, and number three, that we want to conserve energy. Now, when we have any of these things that comes to our life, that we come across in our life, if anything gives us the possibility to conserve energy, we'll be motivated to behave according to that thing. Or if there's anything that we can do to avoid pain, we'll be motivated to go that road. Or if there's anything that will give us pleasure, we'll be motivated to go down that road as well. Now, once a activity or a behavior is learned by us, that activity or behavior can end up as a second nature, as a habit. And from a habit, it can then become an addiction. So addiction is not only to substances, as we'll discuss later, it can also be to habits behavior. We can have behavior addictions. And it's easy to become a victim to addiction. And I want to make this very clear. We should not think that it only happens to other people and therefore we are not victims to addictions. To become victims to addictions is very easy, as we'll see, but it is also easy to break addictions as soon as you understand the way addictions work. So if we know that there are bad habits that we have, or we have addictions, if we know how they work, then I'm not saying it's very easy. I'm not saying it's going to be, over a night you'll be able to break an addiction, although if you can, alhamdulillah. But if you do your utmost and you understand how an addiction works, it becomes much easier. But the easiest way to break an addiction is just to remain away from them, which means that if you know that certain behaviors or certain substances can be addictive, then you take responsibility and you don't even approach those behaviors and substances. Now, yesterday we mentioned a verse from the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, زُيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ حُبُّ الشَّهَوَاتِ مِنَ النِّسَاءِ وَالْبَنِينَ. That beautified for people is the love of the things that they desire, women, sons, heaped up sums of gold, silver, fine branded horses, and so forth. Now, what we want to concentrate on today is the hubbu shahawati minan nisa, the desire of women. Now, when we say the desire of women, what here God is talking about is our desire for, specifically for the pleasure in an intimate relationship. That is something built in within us, and that isn't something bad necessarily. None of these things is bad. Money isn't bad necessarily. As you said yesterday, money isn't bad. Having a horse isn't bad. Having a means of transportation that isn't bad. Having children isn't bad. The problem is when these desires become overwhelming, when they take control of us, then we have a problem. So as Imam Ali salawatullah wa salamu alayhi says, قَلَّ مَنْ غَرِيَ بِاللَّذَّاتِ إِلَّا كَانَ بِهَا هَلَاكُهُ. He says it is seldom that one is seduced by pleasures and is not destroyed by them. So meaning that one thing is to enjoy the good things in the world, which we said yesterday, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made them available for us. It is for us to enjoy. But one thing is then once we have enjoyed those things, that we are actually addicted to them, that we become slaves of them. Imam Ali says, غَالِبِ الشَّهَوَاتِ بِالشَّهْوَةِ قَبْلَ قُوَّةِ ضَرَاوَتِهَا. He says, take control over the desire before it becomes very strong, it becomes too strong. فَإِنَّهَا إِنْ قَوِيَتْ مَلَكَتْكَ. If it becomes powerful, it will control you and it will lead you. It will be the thing that is your guide in life. It will be the thing that motivates you in life. So everything that now is your concentration in life, everything that drives you in life will be these pleasures, this shahwa. And he says you will not be able to resist it. Now, it's not as dark as that. Doesn't mean that you will never be able to break it. We have many hadith that says that the best, for example, the best ibadah is to break your shahwa, is to break your desire, or is to break your habit. Although many hadith says to break the habit is very difficult, is like almost impossible. But then we also have hadith that says to break your habit is a very good thing, and it is one of the best ibadahs to break a bad habit, inshallah wa ta'ala. Now in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that there are certain people who become victims of their desires. There are certain people who are so much dragged into their desires that they take the desires as their gods. In Surah Furqan, he says, أَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهُ أَفَأَنْتَ تَكُونُ عَلَيْهِ وَكِيلًا. He says, have you not seen the one who's taken his desires as his God? Meaning all his attention, all his desires, all his motivation, everything that he wants in the dunya is his desires. Everything that he strives for is to fulfill his desires. He doesn't see anything beyond these desires. This is a problem. He says to the Prophet, will you be a supervisor over such a person? Will you be a guardian over such a person? أَمْ تَحْسَبُ أَنَّ أَكْثَرَهُمْ يَسْمَعُونَ أَوْ يَعْقِلُونَ. As for such people, do you think most people are listening, or that they're using their intellect, that they're actually thinking? إِنْهُمْ إِلَّا كَالْأَنْعَامِ. When you are in such a situation where your desire is what you work for, So you're not looking at higher goals in your life. You're not looking at higher ends in your life. You're not looking at how can I help other people. You're not looking at how you can make the world a better place. You're not looking at how you can reach a better place for yourself in dunya and in akhirah, how you can make your relationship with your Lord better. All these things have no importance to you. When this is the case, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that these people, they are like an'am, they are like cattle. No, بل هم أضلوا السبيل. They're even worse off. And so this is where Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullah wa salamu alayhi says, according to a riwayah, he says, Al-jahilu abdu shahwatihi. He says, the ignorant person is a worshipper of his desires. We don't want to be that ignorant person. Now, here is a question. How come, if we are to enjoy the good things of the world, how come we end up in a situation where we start following our desires? How come there comes a situation that we become that jahil? We are to enjoy this dunya. We read the Quran yesterday. We read the hadith yesterday. We understood it from a logical point of view. This dunya is for us to enjoy. Then how come we are ending up in a situation where we become slaves of our desires and our desires becomes our God? Now, what I want to suggest here is that this is because we confuse desires with well-being. As we said yesterday, well-being is something that we should strive for in dunya and in akhirah. But when we confuse these desires with well-being, this is when we start worshipping our desires. So it begins with the pursuit of pleasure that then becomes a normal state. There's a professor, or a doctor rather, who's called Dr. Robert Lustig. He's written a book on why people become obese and the problems of sugar, right? So he's saying that the main problem in our food is sugar. I'm not going to go into the details of that right now, but he's pointing out that there are several differences between pleasure and well-being. So he says that we've confused the state of pleasure with the state of well-being. We're looking for well-being, but we are confusing it with pleasure. So we think that pleasure will give us well-being. He says, look, number one, pleasure is short-lived, whereas well-being, he calls it happiness, but it's well-being basically. He says well-being is long-lived. He says pleasure is visceral. It's within us, in the body, whereas happiness is ethereal. It is in the mind. He says pleasure is taking, well-being, happiness is giving. He says pleasure can be achieved with substances, whereas happiness cannot be achieved with substances. This is very important. What we eat, what we drink, what we consume, these things might give us pleasure, which is good, but it will not give us well-being in the long run. And then he mentions a few other things, but then he says, finally, the most important of this is that pleasure is tied to dopamine. So we have in our mind, we have things called neurotransmitters. These are the things that transmits different kind of experiences in our mind, so that we experience pleasure, happiness, joy, tiredness, and so forth. These are called neurotransmitters. He says the neurotransmitters that is connected to pleasure is dopamine, whereas the neurotransmitter connected to well-being is serotonin. So we need to understand that there is a difference between these two neurotransmitters, and that we don't become slaves to dopamine. Because once we become slaves to dopamine, we will make dopamine our God, to simplify the concept. Now, what does dopamine do? When we experience something with pleasure, that will lead to dopamine release, and that will give us a sense of pleasure, right? So the brain will register it, and it will want to repeat it. Now, let me give you an example. For example, imagine you've never tasted ice cream before. And this is the first time in your life that you're going to taste ice cream. When you taste that ice cream, it will be pleasurable. Now, you'll want to eat it again and again and again, because the brain has registered this is nice, and it will want to repeat it. Same thing with chocolate. Same thing with everything else. Now, in the natural state, we would never, natural state meaning before the modern era, before we actually learned to process sugar and so forth, we wouldn't get sugar in high amounts. To get the amount of sugar we get from an ice cream, we would need to eat so much fruit that we wouldn't be able to eat that much amount of fruit maybe in 2 or 3 days. So much sugar packed into an ice cream, right? So in the modern day, we have become used to getting things in high amounts. So if getting addicted was easy earlier, in the modern day, it's even easier. This is the jackpot of dopamine. This is jackpot for the brain. The foods that we can eat today, laden with salt, sugar, fat, the drugs that are available, alcohol. Even in old days, you would get addicted to wine, but the alcohol that we have today is even much easier to get addicted to. And as it comes to the intimate relationship between man and woman, where today you don't need a second person. In old days, you would need 2 people for the intimate relationship. Today, you need only yourself and your cell phone or your laptop. And this is something that we need to talk about, because normally this is an overlooked problem. We don't realize how serious this problem is. Now, the brain is always looking for pleasure. When the dopamine is released, the brain takes notice and says, okay, this behavior gave me pleasure. Whether it's a substance or it's a behavior, it could be a substance or a behavior that gives you pleasure, and it will say, okay, fine, this is something that I want more with. Important to remember is that the dopamine doesn't cause pleasure as such. All right. So just by having that high of dopamine, it will not cause the pleasure. It will just make us want the pleasure, right? It will want you, the brain will register that this is something good, and it will try to get more of this. Now, one problem that we will have here is that the brain will register this, we'll have something called neuroadaptation, which means that the neurons get adopted, they get used to the kind of pleasure that you get used to. For example, take smoking or sugar as an example. If you are eating a certain amount of sugar or smoking a certain amount of cigarettes every day, and believe me, sugar can be as dangerous as cigarettes, but we don't want to go into that discussion right now. But if you're used to a certain amount of sugar or smoking every day, after a while, your brain will get used to that amount, and it will have something called neuroadaptation, which means that to get the same high from the sugar or from the nicotine, you will need to add more. This is why they might start out with smoking 1 cigarette a day, 2 cigarettes a day, 3 cigarettes a day, and end up smoking a pack, 2 packs, and so forth, because the mind is getting adopted. The problem is that the rest of the body is not getting adopted. So the brain is getting adopted, but the rest of the body needs more and more and more and more. Well, no, actually the rest of the body is not used to getting more. The brain is the thing that needs more and more and more. The body is getting the same effect. So for example, sugar, if the first time you eat sugar gives you a certain high, the mind will now get used to it, and it will crave more to get the same high, but your pancreas will not get used to the new amount of sugar or the old amount of sugar, so that when you add more sugar, it will release more insulin. It won't be releasing the same amount of insulin that it did the last time. So if you had 10 grams of sugar, for example, the amount of insulin will be in relation to the 10 grams of sugar. But if you have 20 grams of sugar, then the new amount of insulin will be more. It will be in relation to the amount of sugar you ate. Whereas for the brain, because it's adapted, it will release the same amount of dopamine in 2 days or 3 days time for 20 grams of sugar that it did today for 10 grams of sugar, because it's adopting all the time. So the body doesn't adopt. Now the same thing goes with behavior. So if we are behaving in such a way that the mind is now adopting to the dopamine, and we need more and more and more, the body is not necessarily adopting, which means that, for example, people who get addicted to, and this is something that, again, we we need to talk about. This is a problem that is affecting the youth of our society. This is a problem that is affecting elders of society as well to a certain degree, which is the addiction to pornography, which means that people will start watching pornography and they'll get addicted to pornography. And then when they start getting addicted to it, it is very difficult to break the habit. And for some people, it will come to a point where they're not able to enjoy the intimate relationship if there is no pornography involved. So to be with their wives or the spouse, the husband on the other hand, they won't be able to enjoy, they won't be able to have an intimate relationship unless it is actually with the aid of pornography. But we'll get to that in a while. Imam Ali salawatullah wa salamu alayhi says, "Iyyakum wa ghalabati ash-shahawati ala qulubikum." He says, beware of having desires overcome your hearts, for their beginning is an enslavement and their end is ruin. If we are not careful, we'll become enslaved and we will have وَنِهَايَةُ halaka, will be destroyed, will be ruined. So this is something we need to be careful with. Now there's a riwayah again from Amirul Mu'mineen salawatullah wa salamu alayhi. The riwayah says that he was once presented with a sweet fruit, or a sweet dish rather. And so he says, at looking at this sweet dish, he says, you have a fragrant smell and the color is beautiful. I'm sure the taste is delicious, but I hate to habituate my soul to anything since it has not yet formed any habits. Where here Amir al-Mu'mineen, when he says habits, he means addictions or habits to things that are pleasurable. He says, I have not addicted my soul, I have not habituated my soul to these things, and I hate for it to become habituated to these things. What does this mean for us? Does this mean that we shouldn't eat any sweet things, that we shouldn't enjoy any good things? No, Amir al-Mu'mineen is in a class for himself. He's in a level, he's in a league by himself, right? We cannot compare ourselves to that level or that league. But we need to be careful when it comes to things of this dunya. Remember what we said yesterday. Moderation in everything doesn't mean that everything should be in the equal amount. Certain things we need to get in our life, certain things we need to remain aloof from. So we mentioned that today in our life, certain things are available in greater amounts, or it's much more easily available. So if these things are called stimuli, right? For example, if I eat a strawberry, it's sweet. And if I eat it, it's a stimuli. My brain will register that this is sweet and I will want more. Today we have supernormal stimuli. So the sugary food, the cigarettes, the drugs that are out there, and the pornography, which normally we would only get the stimuli from seeing other people, maybe on the street or in the forest, or as it should be with our spouses. Today, the stimuli is supernormal. So today, when people log into the laptop or use their mobile phone, it's so easy to find things which they shouldn't be finding, that they shouldn't be looking, that the stimuli is now called supernormal stimuli. Now, what this gives rise to is an addiction to substance and an addiction to behavior that means that we are no longer satisfied with the normal stimuli. We are now looking for the supernormal stimuli. So in addition to our brains adapting to the normal stimuli and maybe wanting something more, where the base level is the normal stimuli, now the base level becomes the supernormal stimuli. And then from that base level, we are neuro-adopting, which is even more dangerous. So for example, we get addicted to internet, we get addicted to social media. You know, how many likes did I get? How many people are watching me? How many people are following me? How many people are addressing me? And so we get addicted to social media because there's a dopamine rush, or internet, watching news and so forth. And also sugar, and as we said earlier, sugar, food, but other substances as well, and other behaviors. So addictions can be of different types. They could be attachment induced, they could be trauma induced. So these two types, attachment induced and trauma induced, are very important to tackle, but they are not the ones that I want to talk about right now. mostly I want to concentrate on opportunity-induced addiction, and mostly to pornography. Now, what is opportunity-induced addiction? Attachment-induced addiction can have to do with relationships that we have in life, that they will cause us to be addicted to something. Trauma-induced could be as a result of a trauma. For example, someone was sexually abused or other kinds of things that happen in their life. But opportunity-induced addiction is not caused by anyone doing something to you. The reasons why an opportunity-induced addiction occurs is, number one, there is an access from early age. So it could be any of these factors, but the more factors that are there, the more boxes you can tick, the higher the risk for an addiction. And I want to make something very clear here. We're not trying to shame anyone, right? If you know someone who has an addiction, for example, if you know someone is addicted to cigarettes, you will not shame them, right? You'll understand that these addictions are the result of certain substances which is difficult to overcome. That doesn't mean that we accept smoking, but that means that we don't shame them, which rather we try to help them, right? So the same thing goes now for pornography. I'm not saying that watching pornography is good, but what I'm saying is that it's not very helpful if someone has become addicted to pornography to shame that person. Rather, what is helpful is to help them out of that behavior and to help them into a new level of normal, okay? So now, what are the things that will cause opportunity-induced addiction? Number one, access from early age. Now, anyone who has a mobile phone or a laptop has access from early age. Now, if you put a mobile phone in the hand of a 8-year-old or a 10-year-old, they will have access on things on the internet which they should not be watching. They should not be, it's not, their minds are not ready for it. Their brains, their bodies, they're still evolving. Now, it's very natural. They will be interested. They will have a interest in these things. They will have a natural curiosity. And this is what we said yesterday. Not just because something is natural doesn't mean it's right. Doesn't mean it's good. It's natural for them to be interested. It's natural for them to look for these things, but it's not necessarily good. So we need to teach our children, if we want to give a mobile phone, try to block things out, but we also need to have a conversation with them about what not to look for on the internet and so forth. Now, another thing that can give rise to opportunity-induced addiction is the ease of that it's easy at hand. It's easy to get to. Whenever you desire it, it's available, right? Internet speed today makes movies available in such an amount that it would have been unheard of 20 years ago, right? People can just log on and start watching movies. And they have their own phones or their own laptops or their own tablets, which makes things even easier. Another thing is that it's easy to hide the addiction. It's easy to hide the behavior. You can do it in the privacy of your room. You can do it in the washroom. You can do it. And I'm not giving suggestions where to do it. I'm just saying people who have an addiction will do it in these different places. It's easy. Workplace or school, they'll find places. So, you know, when I was young, I know people who go out in the forest and do things. And I don't know if this is still happening, but the easier it is to access it, the easier the opportunity-induced addiction will come. And then another factor is encouragement. So if it is encouraged, it will become easier. Now, the encouragement can be direct or indirect. For example, let me give you an example of indirect encouragement. Indirect encouragement, the music that we listen to. Inshallah, you're not listening to haram music. But if you look at the messages in many of the music that is available out there today, it is directly, both the lyrics and the music videos is directly related to sexual behavior and mostly pornographic behavior, right? Because what happens in pornography apparently becomes a part of mainstream culture. So it's really crazy how easily it's available, and it's being pumped into our children so that when they listen to music, these messages are getting in there. And I'm not talking about subliminal messages. Forget all that. I'm talking about direct messages that we need to be careful with. So there's indirect encouragement and there is direct encouragement. I don't know what happens in Australia, But here in Sweden, I remember when I used to go to school, they used to tell us that it's natural and it's healthy to actually watch these things. They used to say it's natural and healthy because when you watch these things, you explore your sexuality and it's your curiosity and it's okay. You shouldn't be ashamed. And I really wonder what gives them the right to tell us these things. These things back then were uncharted territories. We didn't know when I was young. Inshallah, I'm still young, but I'm talking about when I went to school. We didn't know the long-term effects of these things. Today we do. There are people who report that they have problems in many different types of, or many different fields of their lives. And so there was and might still be a direct encouragement to do these things. So yes, it's normal, it's natural. That doesn't mean it's healthy, and we should be careful with these things. Another issue that we find is that there is no public health warning. A lot of people who have become addicted say that it's actually a factor that drives them to become addicted is that there is no public health warning. If there were health warnings, like you find on the cigarette package, that cigarette can cause lung cancer and so forth. If there were health warnings on the on the pornographic industry, so to say, wherever it's available, to tell people that this is dangerous, then they say that we would have stayed away. Now, I'm here to tell you it is dangerous. We'll tell you some reasons, some results of watching pornography very soon, although we already mentioned a few. Now, before we go there, I just want to mention one thing. As a parent, it is important to learn the right strategy to make sure that your children don't become addicted to pornography or don't start watching pornography, right? There is some investigations that have shown that if you are too strict as a parent in general in life, then when your children get an access to freedom, they will do everything that they couldn't do earlier. On the other hand, if you're too easygoing, so you give your children full freedom, again, they will start doing things that, because they don't have any mental filters, what is right and what is wrong, they'll be doing everything as well. So here it's important to strike a balance, and it's important to have conversation with your children, to speak with your children about what is right and what is wrong. I know it's not easy, to start talking with a 10, 11-year-old about pornography and sexual behavior and so forth. It's not easy, but as a parent, this is something we need to start taking responsibility for. Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullah wa salamu alayhi says, he writes in a letter to his son, he says that I have hastened to write down my will to you before forces of passion or mischief of the world overtake you, that will make you like a stubborn camel. This is he's talking to Imam Hassan now. Although Imam Hassan doesn't need this message, but this is for us. Imam Ali is writing to Imam Hassan, but it is through Imam Hassan for us. He says, I'm hurrying to write this to you before the desires of dunya will make you like a stubborn camel. He says, the heart of a young man is like uncultivated land. It accepts whatever is thrown into it. Whatever you put in the uncultivated land will be accepted. Similarly, in the heart of a young man, whatever you put there will be accepted into that heart. Therefore, he says, I hasten to mold you properly before your heart hardened up and your mind becomes occupied. Therefore, what we learn from this is that we need to address our children at a young age and teach them how to handle this. Now, this is so far as it becomes to someone who is not yet addicted, right? Someone who is still very young, this is what we do. If someone is addicted, now, for example, how will we know that someone is addicted? For example, some markers is that they're constantly looking for sexual pleasure through computer or laptop or the phone or whatever. So they're not satisfied with what they can get in real life. They're constantly looking for it through the computer. They'll also be, when they actually use it, they'll be postponing the sexual release. So although they're watching it, it's not something that they're just watching for 2 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever it might be. They'll be watching for a long time. half an hour, 1 hour, 2 hours, they're postponing the relationship or the release. So it's what we would say about the dopamine. Remember what we said, that the dopamine is not so much about the pleasure, but it's about the road to pleasure. It's actually the dopamine release that we're looking for. It's not the release in itself. And another marker is that, which can happen to other people who are already married, is that they're not able to perform with their spouses. That doesn't mean that anyone who can't perform with their spouses is an addict. But if you're a young man or a young woman and you find that you're not able to perform sexually with your partner, then that could be a cause behind it, right? So what we need to look at here is that if we have this addiction, and even before, why should we let it to go to an addiction? Why not do something about it before it actually comes to an addiction? Because if it comes to an addiction, it will cause so many problems, up to the point that now people will start looking at, because again, we said you need more and more. If your base level is high, you will adopt and you will need more and more and more, which means that people will start looking at things. Today, they might be looking at things that 5 years ago, they would have found unimaginable. Things that, people will find that this is sickening. Things that people will find that, how is it that people are actually finding an enjoyment or pleasure looking at these things? So they need more and more and more. And then they will start looking for that in real life. So they will go to people who charge for sexual help, so to say, sex workers. And that could also cause them other problems, STDs and so forth. And we need to avoid all of these things. So the best thing is, if you don't have an addiction, don't start watching. Not even for curiosity or anything else. If you have an addiction, you need to start dealing with the addiction. You need to start looking for help. You need to start remove things in your life that that are triggers in life, basically, that gives you the cause of going towards these things. For example, being alone in your home, being alone in your room, having a laptop or a computer or a phone in your room. If you have an addiction, you need to remove these things. You need to make sure that you have a strategy in place. When the desire overwhelms you, what do? Do you go to read a book? Do you go sit in the living room? Do you go out of the house? You need to have a strategy to deal with the time when the desire becomes overwhelming, so that you don't become a victim of these things. There is something called decision fatigue. Decision fatigue means that our willpower is very limited. So if we have used our willpower to a certain degree, after a certain degree, the willpower becomes weaker and weaker and weaker. And so we need to make sure that we're not postponing important decisions to later. So for example, you start your day, you've already made decisions that are important for the day earlier. For example, what clothes are you going to wear? What food are you going to eat? And so forth. Once you've made these decisions from beforehand, when you wake up in the morning, you're not making new decisions today, right? So you don't have decision fatigue. For example, when it comes to sugar addiction, if you have sugar at your home, in the morning, you might decide not to eat the sugar. In the afternoon, you might decide not to eat the sugar. But in the evening, you are fatigued. You're tired of making this decision constantly. And so you will go for the sugar. If there's no sugar at home, you won't make that decision. You won't have to make that decision, and there's no decision fatigue. Similarly, when it comes to other types of addiction, especially pornographic addiction, you need to make sure that there are mechanisms in place. For example, things that blocks your internet access to certain sites. Someone else is in control of the password, and so forth, so that you don't have to make that decision time upon time, and minimize the amount of decisions that you have to make during the day. For example, clothes, food, and so forth, so that you are not fatigued. Another way to make sure that we have that we train our willpower and that we don't get affected by decision fatigue is fasting. Fasting is one of those things that will help us to control our desire. Now, if we are not able to do a normal fast, so to say a Muslim fast, which is fasting where we don't eat and drink, then maybe we can just do a hunger fast, meaning that because sometimes we have long work hours and we need to drink, or we need our coffee, or whatever it might be, although coffee is an addiction as well, but it's not a haram addiction, at least not according to the ulama today, but you need, so it could be an addiction that we have, coffee or tea. So if we are not able to fast, a Muslim fast, maybe we're able to postpone our dinner for a while so that we train our desires, so that we train our eating habits, so that we train our willpower. For example, Amir al-Mu'mineen says, نِعْمَ الْعَوْنُ عَلَى أَسْرِ النَّفْسِ وَكَسْرِ عَادَتِهَا التَّجَوُّعُ. He says, the best helper, or an excellent helper when it comes to taming the self and breaking the habits of the self is hunger, to keep hungry. Now, make sure that the keeping hungry does not cause you decision fatigue. So that's important as well. It shouldn't cause you decision fatigue, but keeping hungry can help you overcome decision fatigue and help you strengthen your resolution when it comes to staying away from bad habits. This is why the month of Ramadan is a great opportunity to reform our habits, but we can do that outside of the month of Ramadan as well. And he says in another riwayah, he says, when the stomach is filled, even with permissible food, even when it is with permissible food, the heart becomes blind to salah, to goodness, to reformation. The heart becomes blind. So staying away from food, according to the riwayah, at least not meaning that you go hungry all the time, but making sure that you train your nafs by not allowing too much of that which is halal, will help you combat that which is haram, inshallah wa ta'ala. As we have now come this far, we want to mention one of those heroes from Karbala who practically showed in his actions that he's not addicted to this dunya. When he was asked, and you know where I'm going now, when Qasim was speaking with his uncle, Imam Hussein, on the night of Ashura, and he said to his uncle that, will I be amongst those who sacrifice my life tomorrow? Imam Hussein looked at the young Qasim and he said, Qasim, what do you know of death? What is death for you? And Qasim says, the death for me is sweeter than honey. Allahu Akbar. You know, when Qasim says it is sweeter than honey, he says, for you, my uncle, if I die for you, it is sweeter than honey. He has shown practically that he's not addicted to this world. The desires of this world means nothing for him. He doesn't desire to live for the pleasures of dunya. Yes, dunya is good. We enjoy dunya as far as we can, or the things that give us well-being, the things that will increase our opportunities in dunya and akhirah. But he says, if this dunya, you know, what is this dunya without Hussein? What is this life without a personality like Hussein in your life? He says, it is sweeter than honey. At that point, Imam Hussein looks at Qasim. He says, not only you, my young child will also be killed. Qasim says, will they come into the tents and they will kill your 6-month-old child, and by coming into the tents? How can Hussein tell Qasim that they will come into the tents? But this is not when my child will die. My child will die when I will go out to the battlefield and I will carry him and I will ask, do you have some water for my young child? And they will answer his call with an arrow. On the day of Ashura, Qasim is eagerly awaiting. He sees that so many are going out to the battlefield to sacrifice their lives. He sees all the companions of Hussein going and sacrificing their lives. He sees all the relatives going out, all his cousins, the sons of Muslim ibn Aqil, the sons of Ja'far, the sons of even his own brothers are now going out to the battlefield. But Qasim is still waiting. He comes to his uncle. He tells him time upon time, my uncle, it is time for me to sacrifice my life. My uncle, I want to go to the battlefield. But Hussein is telling him, stay here, stay here. He says, oh son of my brother. He says, you remind me of my brother. He says, I want you to stay with me. I want you to be with me and give me comfort. You know, maybe he's thinking of the time when Imam Hassan was throwing up his liver and whatever was inside him because of the poison. And Imam Hussein was sitting next to him and he was crying, and Imam Hussein was crying, and Imam Hassan looked at him and he says, Hussein, do you cry for me, brother? But la yawmaka yawmaka Aba Abdullah. There is no day like your day, oh my brother, Aba Abdullah. Maybe he was thinking of the days when he would play in the streets of Medina with his brother, when they would be on the shoulders of their father, of their grandfather. Or maybe he was thinking of the days when they would go to the battlefield together, Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein, and defending their father Ali. Maybe he's thinking of the days when they used to sit together with their mother. Maybe he's thinking of the days when they would sit and cry for the calamities that befell upon their grandfather and their mother. Maybe he's thinking of the day when they rushed to the mosque when Ali had been struck on the head. He says, Qasim, you remind me of my father. Qasim, of my brother. Qasim, I cannot let you go. At that point, the Maqtal says, Qasim started to kiss the legs and the hands of his uncle, saying, my uncle, please allow me. This is Qasim, 13 years old. He says, my uncle, please allow me to go to the battlefield. Finally, his uncle says, oh, my son Qasim, will you go towards death with your own feet? And he says, my uncle, how can I not do that when you're surrounded by these enemies? You're all alone. How can I not go to the battlefield and defend you? According to some riwayah, Qasim finds a letter from his father. He presents the letter to his uncle, and at that point Imam Hussein says, fine Qasim, go. I will allow you to go. Now that Qasim has been given permission, Imam Hussein says, wait, come here. He takes out the turban of Imam Hassan. He tears the turban in two pieces. One part of the turban he puts on the head of Qasim as a turban. The second part he's putting around the body of Qasim as if he's putting a kafan on the body of Qasim. Then Qasim goes towards the battlefield. He says, إن تنكروني فأنا نجل الحسن سبط النبي المصطفى والمؤتمن هذا الحسين كالأسير المرتهن بين أناس لا سقوا صوب المزن. He says, if you don't know me, I am Hassan, I am the son of Hassan, the grandson of the messenger, the chosen, the trusted one. And this is Hussein, like a captive held in ransom for amongst the people who may not be, whose thirst might not be quenched by the falling rain. Hamid bin Muslim says that I was in the camp of Yazid, of Umar ibn Sa'ad, when I saw a young man come out, and his moon, he looked like a piece of the new moon. I will say, Hamid, have you thought about this? That if this young man, in your view, in your eyes, looks like the new moon, then think about the mother of the child, think about the father of the child, think about the uncle of the child, how beautiful he must have been in their view. The narration says that Qasim came towards the battlefield. He came out towards the battlefield, and as he was fighting the enemies started to surround him. A man called Amr ibn Sa'ad al-Azdi, he says, Hamid bin Muslim says, Amr ibn Sa'ad al-Azdi, he stood next to me and he said, by God, I will attack this child. He says, I will attack him. And Hamid says, by God, leave him alone. He's a young man. There's already so many people attacking him. I swear by God that if such a young man, is such a beautiful man, were to attack me, I wouldn't do anything against him. I would leave him all alone. But Hamid says no. The enemy, Amr bin Sa'ad, says no. I have made up my mind. He went out to the battlefield. Now when he comes to the battlefield, he goes down towards Qasim. He attacks Qasim. As Qasim is struck, Qasim falls towards the ground. This young man, Qasim, he cries out. He says, oh, my uncle, come to my aid. Oh, my uncle, come to my aid. Oh, my uncle, my Amma, come to my aid. Ya Amma. As Qasim falls to the ground, at that point, Imam Hussein, hearing the cry of Qasim, the narration says he ran towards the battlefield. As he runs towards the battlefield like an eagle, the enemy starts fleeing. The enemies from one side flees to the other side, from the other side towards this side. Poor Qasim is beneath the hooves of the horses. As Imam Hussein reaches Qasim, and the narration says that Qasim was there. He was kicking his heels, he was rubbing his heels heels on the ground. Imam Hussein was standing at the head of Qasim. He says, يَعِزُّ وَاللَّهِ عَلَىٰ عَمِّكَ أَن تَدْعُوهُ فَلَا يُجِيبَكَ أَوْ يُجِيبَكَ فَلَا يُعِينَكَ. It is so difficult for your uncle, O Qasim. You call upon him, he cannot help you. Or when he comes to you, it is of no benefit to you. Qasim takes his last breath. Imam Hussein then takes up the body of Qasim. The narration says, this young man who is so small, when Imam Hussein carries him, the chest of Qasim is at the chest of Hussein, but the fate of Qasim is lingering on the plains of Karbala. Imam Hussein takes the body of Qasim back to the tent. He puts the body of the Qasim next to the body of Ali al-Akbar. As he's put the body of Qasim next to the body of Ali al-Akbar, he sits between them. He takes sand and he puts the sand on his hair. Then he puts one hand on the body of Qasim. He puts the other hand on the body of Akbar. He looks towards the heaven. He says, Ya Rabb al-Alameen, Hussein has lost his sons. وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون يا الله يا الله يا الله يا رحمن يا رحيم يا مقلب القلوب بحق فاطمة وأبيها وبعلها وبنيها والسر المستودع فيها. Oh Allah, we ask you that you forgive us for our sins. We ask you that you save us from bad habits and addictions. We ask you that you don't allow us to go close to bad habits and addictions. And if we are addicted to things that we should not be addicted, that you give us the strength to release ourselves from those addictions and habits, and that you give us the strength of integrity. Allah, we ask you that you hasten the appearance of Imam al-Hujjah and that you join us with his closest associates. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين والسلام على المرسلين وعلى محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين.
Now I request Ali Miqdad to recite now. Huh?
آبا سے تیرا حق ہے زبانہ
تجھے روئے
آبا سے
بس
تیرا
تیرا
حق ہے
حق ہے زمانہ تجھے روئے
آبا سے
سے
تیرا
تیرا حق ہے زمانہ تجھے روئے
آبا سے تیرا
حق ہے زمانہ تجھے روئے
جب شام سحر فاطمہ زہرا تجھے روئے جب شام سحر فاطمہ زہرا تجھے روئے آبا سے تیرا حق ہے
زمانہ تجھے روئے آبا سے تیرا حق ہے زمانہ تجھے روئے
بار ہے کرو ہے درالی پہلے پہ ستمگار کرو ہے کیسے تیرے لاشے پہ سکینہ تجھے روئے کیسے تیرے لاشے پہ سکینہ تجھے روئے آبا سے تیرا حق ہے
زمانہ تجھے روئے
آبا
سے تیرا حق ہے زمانہ تجھے روئے
جس وقت کے اتایا نہ گیا لاشا جوا کا جس وقت کے اتایا نہ گیا لاشا جوا کا شے اس گری اکبر سے زیادہ تجھے روئے شے اس گری اکبر سے زیادہ تجھے روئے آبا
تیرا حق ہے زمانہ
تجھے
تجھے
روئے
روئے
ادب سے تیرا حق ہے زبانہ
زمانہ
تجھے
تجھے
روئے
روئے
زینب نگاہ شام غریبان میں غازی زینب نگاہ شام غریبان میں غازی بے پردے مجھے دیکھ کے بابا تجھے روئے بے پردے مجھے دیکھ کے بابا تجھے روئے آباس
بس
تیرا
تیرا حق ہے
زمانہ
زمانہ
تجھے
تجھے
روئے
روئے
آباس
بس
تیرا
تیرا حق ہے
زمانہ تجھے
زمانہ
روئے
تجھے روئے
سلوات
اللہم صلی
اللهم
علی
صل على محمد
محمد
وآل
وآل
محمد.
محمد وعجل فرج جزاک اللہ السلام علیکہ یا زیادہ وارثہ السلام علیکہ یا ابا عبداللہ السلام علیکہ یا ابن رسول اللہ السلام علیکہ ورحمۃ اللہ وبرکاتہ السلام علیکہ یا وارث آدم صفوت اللہ السلام علیکہ یا وارث نوح نبی اللہ السلام علیکہ یا وارث ابراہیم خلیل اللہ السلام علیکہ یا وارث موسیٰ کلیم اللہ السلام علیکہ یا وارث عیسیٰ روح اللہ السلام علیکہ یا وارث محمد حبیب اللہ السلام علیکہ یا وارث علی امیر المؤمنین ولی اللہ السلام علیکہ یا ابن محمد المصطفیٰ السلام علیکہ یا ابن علی المرتضی السلام علیکہ یا ابن فاطمۃ الزہرا السلام علیکہ یا ابن خدیجۃ الکبریٰ السلام علیکہ یا سار اللہ وابن سارے والبت الموتور اشہد انک قد اقمت الصلاۃ وآتیت الزکاۃ وعملت بالمعروف ونہیت عن المنکر وطاعت اللہ ورسولہ حتی اتاک الیقین فلعن اللہ امتا قتلتک ولعن اللہ امتا ظلمتک ولعن اللہ امتا سمعت بذلک فعزیت بے یا مولاي یا ابا عبداللہ اشہد انک کنت نورا فی الاسلاب الشامخہ والارحام المطہرہ لم تنجسک الجاہلیت بانجاسها ولم تلبسک من مدلہمات ثيابها واشهد انك من داعم الدين واركان المؤمنين واشهد انك الامام البر التقي الرزي الزكي الهادي المهدي واشهد ان الائمه من ولدك كلمه التقوى واعلام الهدى والعروه الوثقى والحجه على اهل الدنيا واشهد الله وملائكته وانبياء ورسله انی بکم مؤمن وبیا بکم موقن بشرائع دینی و خواتیم عملی و قلبی لقلبکم سیم و امری لامرکم متبع صلوات اللہ علیکم وعلی ارواحکم وعلی اجسادکم وعلی اجسامکم وعلی شاہدکم وعلی غائبکم وعلی ظاہرکم وعلی باطنکم زیارت حضرت علی اکبر علیہ السلام السلام علیکہ یا ابن رسول اللہ السلام علیکہ یا ابن نبی اللہ السلام علیکہ یا ابن امیر المؤمنین السلام علیکہ یا ابن الحسین الشہید السلام علیکہ ایہا الشہید وابن شہید السلام علیکہ ایہا المظلوم وابن المظلوم لعن اللہ امتا قتلتک ولعن اللہ امتا ظلمتک ولعن اللہ امتا سمعت بذالک فرضیت بے زیارت شہداء کربلا علیہ السلام السلام علیکہ یا اولیاء اللہ وحباہ السلام علیکہ یا اصفیاء اللہ ووداہ السلام علیکہ یا انصار دین اللہ السلام علیکہ یا انصار رسول اللہ السلام علیکہ یا انصار امیر المؤمنین السلام علیکہ یا انصار فاطمہ سیدۃ نساء العالمین السلام علیکہ یا انصار ابی محمد الحسن ابن علی ولی الناس السلام علیکہ یا انصار ابی عبداللہ بأبي عنتم وأمني تبتم وتابت اللذ التي فيها دفنتم وفزتم فوزا عظيما فيا ليتني كنت معكم فأفوز معكم زیارت حضرت عباس علیہ السلام. السلام علیکہ یا ابن امیر المؤمنین. السلام علیکہ ایھا عبد الصالح المطیع للہ ولرسولہ واشہد انک قد جاہدت ونصحت وصبرت حتی اتاک الیقین. لعن اللہ الظالمین لکم من الاولین والآخرین والحقکہم بدرجک الجحیم. السلام علیکہ یا مولا و ابن مولا. السلام علیکہ یا غریب الغربا. السلام علیکہ یا سلطان ابو الحسن علی ابن موسیٰ الرضا. السلام علیکہ یا اختک فاطمۃ المعصومہ ورحمۃ اللہ وبرکاتہ. السلام علیکہ یا صاحب الزمان علمان 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 من فتنة الزمان. السلام علیکہ یا خلیفۃ الرحمن. السلام علیکہ یا شریک القرآن. السلام علیکہ یا امامنا ھذا اجل اللہ تعالی فرجہ الی یمین وسہل اللہ تعالی مخرجہ الی یمین وظہورک ورحمۃ اللہ وبرکاتہ. اللہم صلی علی محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجہ. سورۃ المبارکۃ الفاتحہ.